in-person session organized by EGROW Foundation. And this topic, I think, is very, very important for all of us in our country, the structural transformation that is taking place in the region. I would like to briefly tell you about the Foundation for Economic Growth and Welfare, which was established on October 31, 2018, almost 6 years ago. The foundation basically aims to provide research-based policy advice to the government and other stakeholders. And to a great extent, we have been very successful in doing projects for the government, especially Niti Aayog and other ministries. As COVID was setting in, we were very worried, and there's lots of research on the EGROW website as to how we thought it's going to play out. And with hindsight, I'm very happy to say that some of the research papers on the website of EGROW would show you that the experts at EGROW were quite right in predicting that this is going to be a very severe pandemic, severely impacting all of us. Lots of research was done, lots of presentations were made, and I'm happy to mention our chairman that time, Dr. Arvind Virmani. He wrote extensively. Our advisor then and even today, Dr. Surjit Bhalla, he also wrote extensively and made presentations. It is around that time when we thought, when there's going to be situations like lockdown, can we do more of webinars and reach out to the world? We are very fortunate during this period from 2019, we have done about 250 webinars every Friday. And when we started, we wanted to make sure we tackle the contemporary economic issues, and not only by domestic experts, but even the foreign experts. And not only contemporary issues within the country, even global issues. And I'm so happy to share with you that we have had a blend of 50-50 speakers from India and from abroad. We have had 3 Nobel laureates come and speak, and I'm expecting the 4th on institutional reforms, because institutions play a very important role, especially at the cusp of Amrit Kal where we are right now. So I'm expecting within the next 2 months we'll have another Nobel laureate who will speak to us about institutions. Under the G20 presidency of our country, we were fortunate to do a series of 11 webinars on new international economic order, 6 on women empowerment, 6 on climate. We wanted to do 11 on women and 11 on climate, but we were so overwhelmed with topics and things that were happening that we had to shelf many of them, and we still hold on to them. We have speakers lined up, but we are not getting the Friday slots for them. We have also been doing lots of research, policy research, which you will see on our website. And then we also started doing some training, which we thought that our young economists, students, and academicians, scholars, researchers across the country should have the advantage of these best minds who come to EGROW, or experts who are ready to affiliate with EGROW and pass on the knowledge. We have been successful in that endeavor also. Today's lecture continues that endeavor to reach out on the best possible speaker list on those issues which we in our country need to think through, and in our country need to really, really discuss them. Structural reforms is one of those. And you will see the depth of presentation today, which Dr. Rahul Giri is going to bring, and our chair, Dr. Surjit Bhalla, is going to contribute. It's a very wide spectrum narration story that he is going to share with us today. So let me then introduce the 2 speakers. Let me introduce the 2 guests. One is Rahul Giri, is our key speaker today. He is a senior economist in the Regional Studies Division of the IMF. Asia and Pacific Department. He has contributed to the Regional Economic Outlook and other regional analysis. He has worked in the African Department and Strategy, Policy and Review Department. I worked there in the IMF myself, so I can tell you these are very enriching departments where he brings his expertise from. He has focused on issues such as monetary policy and exchange rate market reforms in low-income country context, trade integration in Africa, sustainable development goals, and diversification and industrial policies. Before joining the IMF, Rahul was an assistant professor of economics at an institution in Mexico. His academic record is also very sterling. For many of us in India, getting educated at St. Stephen's and D School is a dream, and Rahul has done all that. The session today is being chaired by Dr. Surjit Bhalla. He is our advisor at EGROW, and we are very privileged to have his work on EGROW, and if some of you are interested, you can see it there. He has been the executive director at the International Monetary Fund, and he's seen all that firsthand. He has also been on the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council before he went to the IMF. He's been a member of the Secondary Markets Advisory Committee of SEBI and the National Statistical Commission of India. He writes extensively on economic issues, and I'm sure none of us can miss him in our country. Almost every week he is contributing something. And I have known him from my Reserve Bank days for nearly 2 decades now. With this, sir, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. And what do I do with this?
Just keep it.
Leave it here. Really looking forward to Rahul Giri's presentation. As you know, the topic is, as was mentioned by Charan, of central concern in India, and there are a lot of mysteries that abound, and parallel to the transformation that is occurring. So we look forward to some of the mysteries being resolved by your presentation. Go ahead.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Bhalla, and thank you, Dr. Singh. So thanks to everyone, first of all, for being here, for taking the time to be here. I'll probably talk from there. Might be easier for me to just manage the presentation a bit. Jump right in. So just to give you a little bit of context where this comes from, the Asia Pacific Department every year produces 2 regional economic outlooks, one in April and then one in October. And then during the October outlook, we also do some analytical work which looks at cross-cutting issues for the region as a whole. So this year we are focusing on some longer-term issues, and this is the topic, which is structural transformation. I'll dive a little bit into what we mean by that. And the idea is to inform the future by looking at the past a bit and see what can we say about where Asia might be headed. So just looking back a little bit, I think everybody would agree that the region as a whole has done pretty remarkable job at just catching up with sort of the developed world. You see the chart on the left, which shows GDP per capita for Asia Pacific relative to the G7. And when I say the G7 out here, it's excluding Japan. So essentially, this chart is trying to give a sense of how much is it catching up with the developed countries. And we can see that back in 1990, the GDP per capita for Asia Pacific was about 10% of the G7 level. And by 2020, it has more than doubled it, right? And then that blue line there is the median GDP per capita for the rest of the world, which is relatively steady around 23 or 25%. So, and along with these economic gains in income levels came big gains in human development as well. So this is just one aspect of those human development gains. Here I'm showing the poverty headcount ratio, and that the yellow circles show you Asia Pacific, whereas that gray triangle is the rest of the world. And we can see again from tracking it from 1990 to about 2020, 22 here actually, you can see how the poverty headcount ratio has dropped from more than 25% to about less than 5%. Right? So again, huge gains in basically reducing poverty levels in the region as well. And we can look at other metrics of human development gains, and they tell the same story. Okay, so once we've kind of looked at this, a question that we thought would be useful to ask given the juncture today is, what does this tell us about the future? I mean, one way to rationalize this is to say, well, the region can continue progressing, maybe not linearly, but given how well placed it is, how much progress it has made in the last 3 decades, does that mean that this can be sustained? When we ask ourselves that question, some key issues crop up when we look at the current environment. Okay, so one is fairly well documented, which is that the demographic tailwinds, which have been helping the region over the last 3 decades, are fading very quickly. Okay, some of the countries in the region are already experiencing aging, while other countries, though continue to experience increases in working age population, the pace is clearly slowing down. So that would mean, looking ahead, labor force growth is likely to slow down, which essentially would mean unless we can have offsetting gains in productivity or participation rates, it will be hard to sustain the growth in income the way it has taken place historically. Another interesting change that has happened, especially after the global financial crisis, is a stagnancy in productivity and growth and investment. This is not specific to the region itself. This has been observed sort of globally. Private investment growth and productivity growth have been stagnating since the global financial crisis. And there are different reasons for different regions of the world. And then the third question that gives us a pause, the third issue that gives us a pause is what's been happening to merchandise trade. Again, part of it started after the global financial crisis. That merchandise trade has basically plateaued after the crisis. And then if we take the last few years, what we have seen is an increase in trade fragmentation. So we have seen a lot of pickup in interventionist policies, which is giving rise to an external environment which is not conducive for the kind of merchandise trade growth that Asia has seen over the last 30 years. So given this context, we basically asked 2 questions. What has driven growth and transformation in Asia over the last 3 decades or so? And once we understand that reasonably well, what are the prospects going forward? How does that inform the prospects for the region as we look ahead? To answer those 2 questions, we will combine tools of, say, standard growth accounting exercises, but we'll also look at what is called development accounting, which is to try and ask the question of which sectors might be contributing to growth and which sectors might be actually the ones that are holding back growth. So that's going to be the flavor of the exercise. Given the importance of trade and FDI for the region, we are also going to look at this specific aspect in some detail. I will not be able to discuss maybe everything that's there in the note that we have produced, which is available online, but I'll touch upon some of the things. Why is this useful? Well, one of the narratives that is that comes up as soon as you talk about Asia Pacific is that it's highly integrated into global supply chains, and that has been pretty instrumental in the rise of this export-led growth or export-led rise of manufacturing. Of course, this is not true about all countries in the region, and in fact, we can come to this later. India is probably not an example of this typical narrative that comes up when we think about the export-led rise of manufacturing. But Japan and Korea are sort of prime historical examples that are cited very often in this context. All right, so first let's look at growth from the lens of, say, a standard sort of aggregate framework. So basically using what's called growth accounting. Here the idea is trying to decompose the growth in GDP per capita into different components. And what are these components? So essentially we're thinking about output as being produced using factor inputs being labor, human capital, physical capital, and then there is productivity, which is the total factor productivity. And the chart on the left is showing you the decomposition of this growth in GDP per capita into these different inputs. So what can we take away from this? The first thing to basically flag is that human capital and productivity have contributed positively across the region. So no matter which income group of countries you look at, you can look at advanced economies, emerging markets, or low-income developing countries. All three of them have seen positive contributions coming from human capital growth and total factor productivity growth. The differences show up when you start looking at the contribution of physical capital. And we can see, for example, for the advanced economies, the contribution of capital to output ratio, which is the part in green, has basically been much smaller and in fact has been negative in post-2000s. Whereas if you look at the emerging markets and low-income developing countries, the contribution of physical capital has been much larger. So essentially saying that part of the catch-up growth that emerging markets and low-income developing countries have seen is coming from much more rapid accumulation of capital. Emerging markets look very similar to the advanced economies post-2000s as well. But we can see that low-income developing countries, physical capital has played a much more important role, aggregate level as well. The other is to look at the notion of capital deepening, whether that's essentially per unit of output is capital really contributing to growth or not. So I don't think that picture would change dramatically if you were to do it the way you are explaining it. So qualitatively, I don't think the results are going to change in a big way. Sorry. The other thing to point out is the positive contribution of labor, and that's captured by the employment to population ratio. So again, across the region, we see positive contribution of labor to income per capita. However, if you look at the chart on the right, the story is different depending on which country group you look at. So the chart on the right, what it does is that it breaks down employment to population ratio into two components. The first one being share of working age population to total population, and then the second one being labor force participation rate. So the idea here is, are you getting a positive contribution of labor simply because you have a demographic dividend in play, that you are a young country and your working age population share is rising because of the way demographics are for your economy? Or is it that part of it is coming from being able to raise labor force participation rate, that you have a rising share of people who are looking for jobs, you're basically being able to increase the people who are looking for jobs here. So what you can see is that expectedly, advanced economies in Asia Pacific, which clearly have been aging much faster, the positive contribution of labor has been coming from the fact that they have been able to increase the labor force participation rate. So, but if you look at the emerging markets and low-income developing countries, the demographic dividend is clearly at play here. These are countries that over the last 3 decades have been experiencing increasing shares of working age population. That's the reason for why contribution of labor for these economies has been positive. So so the bottom line from this chart is that this the role of dynamics as we look ahead is going to become increasingly more important. We have already seen that advanced economies are clearly seeing the challenges of a slowing labor force growth. And though emerging markets and low-income developing countries have so far experienced a demographic dividend, this is likely to basically slow down. So picking up on that theme, the chart on the left tries to look at what are the projections for working age population as we look ahead for the next 16 years. So these are essentially looking at United Nations World Population Prospects data and trying to see how the working age population for the Asian Pacific economies is going to change. So the x-axis is change in working age population between 2024 and 2040. And then the y-axis is the change in old age dependency ratio. Okay, so we can see the left quadrant, which is already saying that for some of the economies, working age population is just basically going to shrink, right? So this is the negative quadrant of this chart. And not surprising that most of the economies here are the ones, or at least the two economies or three economies that we are very well aware of, Japan, Korea, Singapore. These have been already facing the challenges of an aging population. But then we also see China is still there. We see Thailand in that category. And then there are economies that will continue to experience positive growth in working age population, but this growth is going to be slower than it has been so far. Right? So essentially underlining the fact that if you cannot offset the demographic drag that is coming, GDP per capita growth is likely to just simply slow down because you will have labor force growing at smaller rates. The chart on the right takes that data, combines it with projections on capital accumulation, human capital growth, and TFP growth, and tries to project what is likely to be the GDP growth for the region by 2030 and by 2040. Okay, so here I think an important thing to mention is that given the slowdown in investment and productivity we have been seeing over the since at least the global financial crisis, those assumptions are baked into these projections. So if those assumptions are going to change as we look ahead, then it's likely that some of these numbers will change. But just to underscore one big number here, what this tells us is, so this is in GDP per capita terms, but we translate into aggregate growth. Last year, Asia Pacific GDP growth was about 4%, and by 2040, I think essentially that's going to decline to about 2%. And most of that decline is going to come from, as the chart shows, it's going to come from the emerging markets and developing economies, which is right at the extreme right. These are the countries that have benefited from a demographic dividend over the last 3 decades, and these are countries that are likely to see the strongest sort of effects of slowing demographics. So what this essentially tells us is, as I said, if demographics is going to basically pan out the way we see here, then barring an increase in productivity or further increases in participation rates, income growth is likely to slow down. So that's what motivated us to start thinking about productivity in a bit more detail as to what are the sources of this productivity growth and what are the sources as we look ahead. And to do that, instead of doing the standard growth accounting exercise, we thought it would be useful to start thinking about how economies are structured and how these structures of economies change over time as they grow. So this is a literature which is called macro literature, which is called development accounting. And a lot of it has been essentially focused on trying to understand how economies transition out of being agrarian and then industrialize and then maybe become service dominated as they grow richer. So here the idea is you think about aggregate productivity as some weighted average of productivities of different sectors, the weights being the employment shares of those sectors. Okay? And if we express aggregate productivity that way, then what we can do is we can decompose the growth in productivity into two components. The first one being the within sector component, which is aggregate productivity can simply grow by the virtue of an increasing productivity in each sector, even if, say, employment shares were unchanged. So there's no change in employment share of any sector, but each sector experienced positive productivity growth, and that led to aggregate productivity growth. The other is that productivity can grow because you can move inputs from low productivity sectors to high productivity sectors. Okay, so that the idea of reallocating resources from one sector to another is what is called structural change or structural transformation. And structural transformation will contribute positively to productivity growth if labor and capital can be reallocated from low productivity sectors to high productivity sectors. So here, what we are showing is contribution of those two components to aggregate productivity growth between 1990 and 2018. And we've broken this down by advanced economies, emerging markets, and low-income developing countries. And essentially, we can see that structural change or this reallocation process matters the most for the low-income developing countries and then for the emerging markets, and it carries the lowest contribution for the advanced economies. So for the low-income developing countries, it accounts for about 38 to 40% of the overall growth in aggregate productivity between 1990 to 2018. For the emerging markets, that number drops to about a quarter, so it accounts for about 26% of the aggregate productivity growth. And for advanced economies, it's fairly small. So most of the growth in aggregate productivity for advanced economies is coming from individual sectors essentially experiencing increases in labor productivity. Here, let me just be very clear that this is labor productivity growth and not TFP. And the reason to show labor productivity growth here is when we want to break data down by sectors, it becomes increasingly hard to get comparable data on capital stocks. So we have data on 12 sectors. We have data for value added, data for employment, data for price indices of value added. So we can compute labor productivity fairly accurately, but since we don't have data on capital, it's hard to do the exercise with TFP here. So given that structural change is contributing pretty heavily to the emerging markets and low-income developing countries, a natural question that arises is what is the nature of this reallocation? So if it accounts for 40% for low-income countries and about a quarter for emerging markets, where is labor moving from which sector to what sector, right? So what is the nature of reallocation taking place? So the chart on the left shows you that essentially for the region, the biggest contributor to this reallocation has been a movement out of agriculture. So here we are aggregating sectors into three categories. You have agriculture, industry, and services. And as I said a moment ago, we had data on 12 sectors. So we are taking those 12 sectors and putting them into these three buckets. And just to define these buckets, agriculture is a sector on its own. So you have agriculture, forestry, you have fishing here. In industry, you would have manufacturing, construction, mining, and utilities. And all other sectors basically are going to fall into the bucket of services.
But did you try and break down agriculture into modern agriculture and traditional agriculture?
Unfortunately, the data, we would not have the data to be able to actually do that. I think it's possible to do that with more disaggregated data, but then you lose the ability to compare across countries. So we can certainly dive into that if we did it for an individual country. I think we would be able to do it. Agriculture, as we can see, in 1990, it accounted for about 60% of employment, of overall employment for the region. By 2018, that share has dropped to about 30%. So share of agriculture has gone down by a factor of 2. And that if you break that down further by what's happening across economies of different income levels, you can see expectedly that process is being driven by the emerging markets and low-income developing countries. So, which connects to the chart that I had shown on the previous slide, that structural change contributes more to the productivity growth of low-income and countries and emerging markets. So clearly, the process of moving out of agriculture is something that happens early on in the development process. The flip side of getting out of agriculture and your resources shifting out of agriculture and moving into industry and services is this process of industrialization, right? So this chart shows on the x-axis income levels expressed in purchasing power parity terms in log scales, and on the y-axis it shows the share of industry in value added. We can do this for share of industry in employment as well. what we're going to discuss is basically qualitatively going to hold. The gray dots here are essentially countries in the rest of the world, and the red dots are countries in Asia Pacific. So what is this chart basically trying to convey? As economies get out of agriculture, they tend to get into other sectors, and we can see that this process has a certain relationship with income. Right? So on the left axis, on the left side of this x-axis, you have the poor economies, mostly with very low levels of value-added shares of industry. So these are what we would call mostly agrarian economies. They're dependent on agriculture for value-added and employment. But then as these economies get richer, the importance of industry in value-added rises. It reaches a certain peak, and then beyond that income level, it starts declining. So this is the value-added share of industry, right? So the story here is that as incomes go up, the importance of industry in value-added of the economy goes up. It reaches a certain peak, and then beyond that, it starts declining, all right? So, and beyond that, essentially, it's not that it starts declining because economies, maybe the share of agriculture rises. No, what happens is the share of service rises. So agriculture share declines as incomes rise, industry share increases, reaches a peak and then declines, and then services shares rise. So here, as I said, the red dots are basically the Asian economies, and it's instructive to look at this, how these red dots move as we go through time. So the red dots right now are for 1990, right? So we can then basically look at red dots in 2004 and then look at them in 2018. So essentially what we see is, as the region has gotten richer, it has industrialized more, and then as it has gotten even more richer, that level of industrialization is coming down slowly, right? So this is this usual narrative that we tend to see with sort of Asia Pacific as a region as a whole, that a lot of the income growth in the region has been accompanied by a pretty intensive process of industrialization. And you can see this basically in 2004, that many of these red dots are essentially above this line, which is sort of an average fit to the data. So telling us that Asia overall, compared to the rest of the world, is much more intensively engaged in industry than the world on an average, right? So, so what this chart sort of raises as a question is, if historically industry has been a driver of growth for the region, and as the region's gotten richer, the importance of industry is declining, then what does this mean for the future of growth in Asia Pacific, right? So, and this was a question that came up: where is India in this spectrum? So we can see India lies below this curve, and India, if we were to dive a little bit deeper to just show you a little bit of the timeline, then it would look little bit like this. Right? So this is employment that's value added. So that was the chart we were seeing. And essentially we can see, and for comparison, and why did I pick Vietnam? Because Vietnam and India had similar income levels in PPP terms back in 1990. And we can see that Vietnam's value added share of industry, or actually manufacturing here, not industry, has risen fairly quickly. India's value added share has also risen, but not as quickly. And the comparison is even more stark if you look at what's happened to employment share of manufacturing. India's employment share has risen, but well, the employment share of manufacturing in Vietnam has really kind of exploded in comparison, right? So India certainly doesn't, it's not the usual narrative that is associated. The average narrative doesn't fit India's trajectory in terms of industrialization, right? So when we think about whether the industrialization process that has sort of motored growth historically, can it continue to play as important a role? The missing piece here basically is what are the factors that have driven this industrialization, right? So to be able to think about what's likely to happen as we look ahead, we need to understand what are the factors that have driven this process of industrialization. So there are three core forces that one needs to think about when we think about industrialization, especially I think for Asia Pacific. Two of them are usually well documented across the region when you think about structural change, but I think the third factor, which is trade, it plays a more important role for Asia. So the first is the role of increases in productivity of the three sectors that we have been looking at, so agriculture, industry, and services. The typical sort of development path that happens is you have at low levels of income, a lot of your employment and value added comes from agriculture. Most of the people are engaged in agricultural activities, and then as agricultural productivity increases, that allows workers to be able to reallocate to other sectors of the economy. Now here, the key here is, of course, you can do that to the extent you are able to meet the demand for food. There is a lower bound as to how quickly can people get out of agriculture. Well, that's dependent on whether the subsistence demand for food is met or not. So increases in productivity in agriculture is key for workers to be able to get out of agriculture and get reallocated to other sectors. As incomes rise, traditionally, these workers basically go to the industrial sector. And then as incomes rise further, that's when these workers get reallocated to services. The reallocation towards services, the process is one where the demand for services increases faster than the demand for manufacturing goods. And the reason for that is that services tend to be more income elastic than manufacturing durable goods. So as incomes go up, the demand for services rises faster than the other goods. However, what happens is that traditionally services are thought of as growing at a slower rate of productivity. So to meet the demand for services, you need more and more workers shifting out of these sectors and going into services. Okay, so that's the usual trajectory that countries, at least if you look at the developed countries of the world, that's the usual trajectory they have followed. This is not the trajectory that has been followed by every country here, and then we have looked at India's case. Certainly doesn't look like the trajectory that India is following so far. Okay, so there are clear examples of exceptions to this. Australia and New Zealand also are examples where they are basically transitioning out of agriculture and where industrialization isn't picking up as much as you have seen in the historical examples. If you step outside of Asia and you look at countries in Latin America, you look at countries in Africa, you again see transition out of agriculture and going towards services with industrialization looking nothing like what Asia has experienced. Okay, so this is an average relationship that is observed, but there are clearly countries that are above this average and below this average, right? So looking ahead, the third factor that I had highlighted, which plays a role for Asia Pacific, yeah.
You know that China played a very prominent role in industrialization and robbing many countries of their industrialization. You know, even in India, we suffered badly because right in our neighborhood, China took away our transition path. Now, when you've done this analysis, have you factored that part in? Because in this region, China has played a very dominant role in sort of distorting this historical curve.
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. So when we do this exercise, there is nothing explicit there that is trying to account for the role of China as to why the outcomes for some of the countries have been different relative to the average behavior that we have seen.
And if I can add
Sure.
to Chern's, and exactly on China, that what explains, whether it's the share of industry or particular share of manufacturing has a particular shape around the world, and China has been able to maintain it at a very high level for an extraordinary length of time. What is, and we in India are constantly saying we have to, as you know, so what explains, what is the special factor in China that allowed them to challenge the structural transformation of a decline in manufacturing?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a great question. So maybe two-part answer. First one, I think, to the question of whether we take into account China's effect on the outcomes of other countries, the answer would be not directly. I mean, we don't do any accounting for China's effect on why industrialization, say, in India looks different. Or could India's industrialization would have been higher than the path it took had China not become as dominant. However, I think Danny Roderick has a paper back in 2013 or maybe 2016 where he tries to argue the same point. He says that some of the currently developing economies have experienced what he calls premature deindustrialization. That they are industrializing, yes, but they're not industrializing as rapidly or as intensively as some of the historical examples, right? So you can think about Japan and Korea in Asia, but you can also look at the developed world. You can look at the US, you can look at the United Kingdom, and look at peak levels of industrialization they reached. And his argument is that this peak that we see here in this curve, if we plotted this curve decade by decade, say we did this for 1990, we did this for 2000, then we did this for the decade of 2010 to 2020, his argument is that this curve is becoming sort of lower and lower, which is saying that for the same income level, countries are reaching a lower peak of industry. And that's what he refers to as premature deindustrialization. Now, in that, one of the things that he argues is exactly this, that you, as a country, you can sort of import this premature deindustrialization because you have a competing country that is growing much faster in terms of productivity. So that's certainly possible, but we don't do this accounting for this exercise.
I know. And, again, this is with particular reference to the debate in India, etc. Has Danny or the IMF, etc., looked at the possibility of how much of the premature industrialization or deindustrialization of the rest of the world is because of China's dominant industrialization?
Well, at least I'm not aware of a paper that specifically quantifies that. It's certainly something that we can try and look into and try to see what that entails. I mean, but in terms of just the forces at play here, if we were to just look at the way this is thought of in the literature, that would mechanically mean that China's labor productivity in industry must be rising much faster than any other country. Now, but that doesn't tell us much about why that is happening, right? So that's a mechanical explanation for why, what would explain that. So, I mean, one thing, it certainly is, China looks very different when you look at international integration, say, compared to India. So their trajectories have been very different along that dimension. Whether there are other dimensions where China has has had a different policy implementation, I think that's worth looking into. At this point, I wouldn't have a very precise answer as to why that's certainly the case. Yeah.
And Anne Kruger did a beautiful work on the missing middle,
Yeah.
where she did speak about China playing this role and countries which got so badly impacted, India being one of them. Maybe that literature could help you quantify this.
Sure. Yeah.
Perhaps to the hypothesis that trade integration is the defining factor, you see Vietnam, Laos, Thailand, other countries in Asia that developed alongside India, but are actually well above the curve despite China, right? So it's not a fatality. Maybe indeed the attitude and openness to trade is a differentiating factor.
Yeah, but that also would mean, sir, if you
Scale
could,
is
just
different.
one observation, that the transition had to take to services. And in that sense, the transition in India happened earlier than what would it have happened had it followed the natural recourse.
Is this Myanmar that is doing better than India?
That's Malaysia.
Malaysia.
Yeah, MYS. Yeah. So I think at least in terms of the kinds of countries that are above this line, right, above this curve, it at least lends sort of credence to the story that these are also the countries that are much more heavily integrated into global supply chains compared to India. So at least one dimension where India looks very different compared to these countries is integration into global supply chains. But that being sort of the silver bullet, I don't think that that's the whole answer to it. There are more reasons for why this may be the case, but that's certainly one dimension where India looks different compared to these sort of the Southeast Asian economies.
Let's not call it global supply chain. Let's call it China's supply chain.
Possible. I mean, we would have to look at it. These are obviously very highly integrated with the Chinese economy itself, certainly. But why is it? I mean, it raises the question: why is it that these countries are able to engage in those supply chains and some other countries aren't able to? So, and whether that is the critical reason for why industrialization looks different, I think that's something worth looking into, absolutely. So if you think about why these countries are, so look at Korea, for example. I think Korea is at an income level that is way richer, but at industrialization that's comparable to China. So what is it that allows Korea to actually do that? I'm not saying that this should happen or shouldn't happen. I'm not trying to make that point. I'm just simply trying to explain what we observe and what are the possible correlates of why we are observing what we are observing. I mean, that's a different debate, whether we should be doing this or we should be doing that, or X country should be doing or not doing that. I think that's a policy level debate that policymakers will have to decide. I'm saying if we look at industrialization and we look at possible reasons for why this is happening, then these are the possible correlates of what might be playing a role. We know that Korea has been able to consistently raise the amount of value added it exports. And otherwise, if you look at Korea's income level, it would be hard to explain why it's so rich and yet so industrial compared to the average. So again, not taking a stand on whether this is good, bad, neutral. I'm simply trying to explain what the facts are here. That's pretty much it. All right, so the third factor that I basically want to talk about is exactly the role of trade. Now, why does trade matter here? Trade matters because as your productivity rises, say, as you transition out of agriculture into industry and your industrial sector productivity is rising, the industrial sector is also the sector whose goods are traded the most globally. All right. So why can this help or hurt your structural change process? Well, if you're good at, in a comparative advantage sense, at producing some of these things, then your market is not simply limited to the market size that you have domestically. Then you have the ability to basically overcome the limits of your domestic demand and be able to export outside your own territory and be able to therefore expand much more into industry than would have been allowed just by the limits of what your domestic demand is. All right, so now if you look at Asia, how integrated it looks compared to the rest of the world, we can see that the importance of trade in Asia Pacific has risen pretty dramatically. So from 1995, where trade to GDP ratios were below 40%, and then rising up to 60% by the global financial crisis. Right? So it has become very rapidly integrated into the international economy, and that does play an important role in explaining, say, why China or why Korea or, for example, why Vietnam have been able to industrialize much more than some of the other countries. And this chart on the right essentially takes that idea and tries to estimate how much can it contribute to that rise in industrial value added, or in this case actually manufacturing value added. So what it does it does what is called a local projection regression, and what it's trying to ask is, if you increase exports to GDP of the manufacturing sector, so the ratio of exports, manufacturing exports to manufacturing value added by say 10%, what is the impact on the total value added share of the manufacturing sector in your economy? So a 10% point increase in exports to GDP of the manufacturing sector leads to about an increase in manufacturing value added of 6 percentage points. So which is not trivial, which is a fairly large impact.
Rahul, it again brings this graph on the left side.
Yeah.
So the period that you are plotting here takes care of the Asian crisis, right? When 4 of those countries just vanished. Now, I don't understand that where does that get captured. But what I get a feeling is
Yeah.
that this is, if you had prepared this chart keeping China out, maybe the curve would not be like this. And
If we had taken China out of this,
yes,
yeah.
because probably China is dominating the trade totally. And if you look at the fall that is happening around 2007-8,
Yeah.
is that because of
The global financial crisis.
financial crisis?
Yes.
So that is explained. Then this rise that you showing from 95 to
Yeah.
2007
Yeah.
is probably China dominated.
So we have done this without China, so it will look a little bit lower than that, sure.
Okay.
But if you look at some of the other ASEAN countries, they look very highly integrated. Their trade to GDP ratios are much higher, above 50% or so. So it's not just China. It's certainly a lot of those economies. But yeah, you're right that if we excluded China from this, it would look a little bit less steep.
Flat.
But qualitatively, the fact that Asia is integrated a lot into the world economy would remain. And qualitatively, this downward trend that happens post the global financial crisis would still survive. Maybe. So, yeah, I think the qualitative story won't change. Yeah, quantitatively, things might look more along the lines of what you have in mind.
Okay.
So the chart on the right, what explains the dip in year 5? That on the change in manufacturing.
I mean, it's basically that this is unlikely to be the case that this can keep on expanding. That at some point you're going to hit some sort of diminishing returns to be able to. It's not as if you can keep on exporting more and raise your market share.
So the changes every year accumulates over time.
Yes. Yeah. So it is still positive, but cumulatively, the aggregate basically starts dropping. So the important point I want to make, having made the point that Asia is much more integrated, and that integration has risen very rapidly, is this part, which is, if you look at what's happened after the global financial crisis, this engine which has helped Asia industrialize seems to be basically slowing down. Right? So post 2008, we can see that there's a large dip, and yes, there is some recovery, but that recovery isn't strong enough to be able to basically offset this plateauing of trade. And since Asia has been so dependent on trade, this essentially doesn't paint a pretty rosy picture when we look ahead. It's a bit of a cautionary tale.
So the dips which are taking place towards the end of these curves, I think your data is plotted till 2022?
2022, yes.
22.
Yeah,
Now,
so
the upsurge in sort of protectionism that has started, is that what is the reason for all of these falling down?
I think part of it is COVID.
Part of it.
So it's hard for me to say. It looks very much like this is maybe most likely around 2018. And we know that a lot of that uptick starts happening around 2016, 17. And then it keeps, so I think it's both in some sense. It's very hard to disentangle which one's what. But a lot of the steep drop that you see here is certainly COVID. Yeah. The third piece to this sort of puzzle of what the future is likely to look like is what's happening to services in Asia. Right? So the dominant story about Asia Pacific is about industrialization, and in some sense, we feel that the role of services is actually underappreciated in Asia Pacific and often not recognized enough. So the left chart essentially shows you this relative over-industrialization. When I say over, relative to this curve, right? So a lot of these red dots are above this black line. That Asia Pacific is more intensively industrialized, and what that means is that gets reflected in the importance of the service sector in value added. So the red dots here, which are Asia Pacific, tend to be below these gray dots, which tells us that at any given income level, it's likely that the Asian economies have a lower share of services in employment compared to the rest of the world. So Asian economies on an average look less service dependent compared to the rest of the world. That's at any given income level, but what happens over time here? So this right chart essentially tells that story. Over time, we know that Asian economies have moved out of agriculture and moved into industry and services, But what's the relative importance of these two sort of sectors that have been absorbing this labor that's moving out of agriculture? So here, the sectors that I'm showing are more disaggregated than just rather than calling them industry and services, we have disaggregated them into more granular categories. So industry has mining and industry has manufacturing, and then industry has what is called industry non-tradable. And non-tradable industry is essentially construction and utilities. These are things that are not as traded as manufacturing and mining. And similarly, services are broken down into tradable, non-market, and non-tradable. Tradable is transportation, trade. Trade would mean wholesale trade and retail trade, distribution services, and then banking and finance. Non-market services are government services, and non-tradable services are real estate services and what we call other services, in which you have personal services, recreational services. And then lastly, we have the agriculture sector. So what I'm showing here is the share in employment. When we know this story, which is agriculture share declining. And here we wanted to look more granularly what's happening to the absorption of labor that's coming out of here in the other sectors. And what's clear is that compared to the industrial sector, service sector has played a more dominant role in actually absorbing this labor. So service sector share went from about 20% to about 40% over the same time period. And industry share has risen, but important thing to underscore here, which may not be very visible, is that manufacturing share within industry hasn't risen as rapidly. So it's some of the other categories which are, say, mining, that are contributing, which are these light green, that are contributing much more. So you can see this dark green is rising, but not rising as much. And if you look at what happens post 2015, this actually shrinks a little bit instead of rising. So manufacturing is plateauing relative to services, and services are rising. And specifically within services, it is the tradable services, which is trade, transportation, banking, and finance, that are playing the most dominant role here in explaining why service share is rising. So I think a key thing here is this part of the transformation in Asia is often overlooked as to what's happening to services. It's mostly the stories about manufacturing and industrialization. And it's clear from here that services are actually playing a more dominant role in providing employment than manufacturing is.
And why is the share shrinking in manufacturing? It's AI, ML, it's computerization. What could be the factors?
I think here, so this is a weighted average. So here, I think again it goes, a part of the story is what's happening to the larger economies that had these large employment shares in manufacturing. And those economies are getting richer. And therefore they are likely to shed workers out of industry. So, China, you have Thailand, Malaysia, Korea, all these economies that relative to the average have larger shares in manufacturing, they are the economies that are actually shedding workers out of manufacturing. Another way to say that is that their productivity levels are rising and they don't need as many workers to be able to do the same amount of, produce the same amount. So this brings us to start thinking about what are the prospects as we think about this.
5 more minutes?
Sure, okay. So very quickly, to think about what are the prospects lying ahead. I mean, the story so far that I have basically told is, yes, Asia did industrialize more intensively, but what we can see is that it's reached an income level. A lot of the economies have reached an income level where the importance of industry is likely to decline. What we also see is trade isn't likely, or it's looking like trade's role is not going to be as dominant as it used to be. So if you're an Asian economy industrializing now, it's likely the case that you're not going to benefit from trade as much as some of the previous sort of typical examples. And third, services have been playing an increasingly important role as over time. So if we put that together, what can we learn as we look ahead? So here, what we do is actually now go behind these employment shares and value-added shares and start digging into productivities a bit. to really learn what is driving some of these patterns. So here what I'm showing is productivity gaps. And by productivity gaps, what I mean is take any sector, compute the labor productivity in that sector, and express that as a difference relative to the top 3 most productive countries. So think of those top 3 countries as being the frontier productivity level, and you're just trying to assess how far or how close are you to that frontier level of productivity. And we can do that for each of the sectors. Here what I'm showing is agriculture and manufacturing. And on the x-axis here, we do the same exercise, but this time instead of thinking about a sector, you think about the whole economy. So express output per worker or GDP per worker as a difference from the top 3 most productive countries for the economy as a whole. So what you're trying to assess here is, if I see a certain aggregate gap in income level relative to the most productive countries, how much of that gap is coming from agriculture, how much of that gap might be coming from manufacturing, and so on. So for the chart on the left here shows that the agriculture gaps are basically larger than your average gap. So this is the 45-degree line. If all these dots lined up on this line, that would mean that the gaps in agricultural productivity are exactly as large as the gaps for the aggregate economy. If these are above the line, that means that agriculture is a sector where you have larger productivity gaps than the average. And if these dots are below the line, that would mean that sector is actually much closer to the frontier than the economy as a whole is. So this is sort of a sector that's actually leading the growth in the economy. So here, the agriculture story is that agriculture is holding back the growth of income. The gaps in agricultural productivity in 1990 and in 2018, they are both above this line, and not much has changed between 1990 and 2018 relative to the frontier. So if these gaps could be brought down, you would contribute to raising the income level. But bringing down these gaps means what? If you raise labor productivity in agriculture, a natural question to ask is, increasing labor productivity would mean you would end up shedding workers, and where would these workers basically be reallocated? So they could go into manufacturing. That's the traditional story in Asia, that they would go into manufacturing. Well, how large are the gaps in manufacturing? They're roughly as large as how they are for the aggregate economy, which means, yes, you would do better by absorbing them into manufacturing. But if manufacturing gaps are as large as for the aggregate economy, there must be other sectors where the gaps are actually even smaller. So if this is your average, there are sectors that are worse than average, there are sectors that are roughly similar to the average, and there are sectors that are actually better than the average. So yes, reallocation from agriculture to manufacturing would be beneficial, but reallocation from agriculture to something non-manufacturing seems much more beneficial in terms of being able to raise income levels. Right, so that's the sort of the big takeaway from here, and to me that was a little bit of a surprise. I thought manufacturing would be sort of the leading sector here in terms of driving the catch-up process. We can take that and then ask a more direct question, well, relative to manufacturing, what are the sectors that are most productive? So I can express productivity in each sector relative to manufacturing, where being 0 means you're exactly as productive as manufacturing, below 0 means you're less productive than manufacturing, above 0 means the productivity in this sector is higher than manufacturing. And so we can see agriculture is less productive, trade seems to be less productive, other services sort of comparable, mining some overlap with manufacturing but a little bit higher, but then again the tradable services into which we saw reallocation happening are again basically sectors that tend to have productivity that is higher than manufacturing. So transport, business, finance, and then construction really stands out in terms of having higher labor productivity than manufacturing.
Sorry, isn't labor productivity directly proportional to capital intensity?
So I think that's something to keep in mind here, which is why I think not having data on capital kind of mixes things up a little bit here. So for the fact that, for example, construction comes out so high, it's a natural candidate that a lot of it is being driven by high capital intensity.
So it means that the ability to reallocate labor is so much less in highly capital intensive sectors,
Sure.
right?
Sure. So I take that point. I think It would be nice to have the data where we have TFP here and to be able to clearly say. But again, I think we have to be careful because TFP again is a residual. So what is it that we are capturing there? Again, it's not very, so yes, if we have a critique of this as being maybe this is partly driven by capital, then TFP is also a little bit, what is it that it captures? Is it true productivity? Is it capturing some of the policies? Is it capturing some of the market distortions? It's not very clear. It acts as a wedge, not more like an explanation of things.
I'm thinking about the policy implications. If the policy implication is that you should move labor from agri to those where labor productivity is much higher, you
Sure.
can do this in highly capital-intensive sectors.
Yeah, so I think 2 points there. One is, it is not purely a function of productivities. It's also a function of demand, right? So this is the supply side of the economy. Question is, there is a demand side of the economy, and how much of these activities will flourish is also dependent on how much of these activities are being demanded at given the income level. So yes, construction looks great, but housing has a natural process for how much demand there is for housing, right? So I think that's the other thing. The other thing is, and the second point being, this is a static picture. This doesn't tell us about anything about how these sectors contribute to how much of the catch-up is. Last point to make here, which is, over time, which of these sectors help to catch up? So the idea of catch-up is, the less productive you are today, the faster you're likely to grow. That we see in this whole growth literature, that poor countries tend to catch up to the richer ones. What we do is we take the same idea and then we apply it to the labor productivity at the sector level and try and assess whether we see catch-up happening in each sector or we see in some sectors that are driving this catch-up process. The dark green lines are where we see statistically significant catch-up. And the light green lines are bars are where we don't see much of a catch-up basically. So again, what comes out of this is dynamically also, the business and finance seem to be contributing a fair bit to catch-up process. Manufacturing, yes, there is catch-up, but it isn't statistically significant. So these services also contribute to dynamic gains to income levels. So that's the other point to make. Let me conclude because we're going to run out of time. Last bit here, which is, so far, people have basically focused on merchandise trade. Trade in services has been rising pretty rapidly, and if you look at this chart that I showed here, and you did this for services, it would look dramatically different. It would basically look something that blips a little bit here, and then keeps on rising. So this plateauing of trade that we see for merchandise, for goods, doesn't exist for services at all. They basically, after the global financial crisis, nothing has changed for service trade. So this, underlining the point that as we look ahead, we should be more focused on the fact that services are going to be increasingly tradable by virtue of the technology that we have today. And Asia doesn't seem to be...
Well, in that study that you did, which shows the curve is far more steeper in services, what would be the services that played a key role? Is it IT-related services, or is it business, insurance?
No, a lot of these business, finance, computer services, telecom.
So the catch-up which you were showing there, in this catch-up.
Yes.
So all these on the extreme left, business, finance, these would be the ones where the catch-up is taking place.
Yes, exactly that. Towards industry is basically the way to grow fast. Yes, that's been there, but it's not the only game in town. It seems like services can contribute to growth, and some of the modern services can contribute to basic static gains in productivity, but also dynamic gains in productivity. Some things that might be useful to think about as we think about how we could attack some of these problems. Services tend to be actually sectors that have high barriers to entry and have lower levels of competition traditionally. So lowering barriers to entry in services would be important. Services are also, as I said, where the region as a whole seems to underperform. And therefore, increasing tradability of services and boosting integration services might be a key as we look ahead. To close the agricultural productivity gaps, focusing on how can we improve agricultural productivity is going to be pretty important. And there is no magic bullet here. I think you have to go country by country and think about what is holding back agricultural productivity. So what is relevant for India is going to be probably very different from maybe what's relevant for Indonesia and so on. It's critical from a structural transformation standpoint. As the workers go out of agriculture, they need to have the skills to be employed in some of these expanding sectors. So education and upskilling is going to be critical as well. I'm going to skip this part, maybe just mention this last part. Given upskilling is going to be very important, something that's actually very important as we look ahead is the role of AI. We know that this technology is improving very rapidly. We did some analysis on this as to which sector is likely to affect much as we look ahead. Essentially, the chart on the right kind of paints a picture which is a little bit worrying, maybe for some countries, maybe it's not for others. So you can see if you go by which occupations it will affect and then how those occupations are distributed within sectors, we can essentially show that services are likely to get affected much earlier than some of the traditional manufacturing roles or agricultural roles. So countries that are heavily exposed in services, especially some of these high-end services, think about business process outsourcing as well. Those are the sectors that will probably get affected first as a result of the development of this technology. So here again, I think, empowering digitization, ensuring that workers would have the skills to actually leverage these new technologies is going to be very crucial when we think about the future. Let me stop here. Thank you so much for the great discussion.
You have a question?
Yeah.
Activities. If you think of India, there is a case to be made that there's overemployment, right? Or actually underemployment in agriculture. There's lots of people doing highly unproductive work that barely adds anything to outputs, but they're there because agriculture is a safety net, right? So the idea that these people could be somehow magically released and reallocated to other sectors seems unrealistic, right? Or doesn't really match with the observed reality that you see.
Okay.
So is that recommendation holding?
Yeah. Okay.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you, Rahul. Very excellent presentation.
No, thank you.
My two questions. One is there is a trade-off between livelihood and jobs, and because AI is to replace the jobs, and India in particular has seen the unemployment rate and other things. So it's not only losing the livelihood, but also it has a repercussion on your social fabric.
Absolutely.
And it leads to lack of peace and things like that. That is one. And then digital, because it's always a dilemma whether to go wholeheartedly on digitalization, because that will replace the job. That is what people under. So how to balance, that is one. Second, demographic pressures brings down the growth rate. So how you see the China's policy, because they were doing earlier the one-child norm, then they relaxed it 2, 3, and so on and so forth. I'm sure they are also conscious of the fact that if they relax, the demographic pressure will be more, and therefore their economic strength will come down. So what's your take on this?
Okay.
Two options.
Even on its manufacturing part, given that a lot of MSMEs are thriving these days and they are not necessarily, if I may say so, upskilled enough to be absorbed in service sector. And given that looming threat of AI also, most of the jobs in service sector are replaceable by AI and ML. So how do you suggest that we go forward, making our manufacturing sector robust and be able to integrate in global supply chains?
Sure.
And there was one more. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rahul. Vidasi, you have given a very good presentation, and analysis is also very much exhaustive. One paradox I see in the Asian country vis-a-vis India, that is the employment sector in last. But in case of India, we see recently this employment share in agriculture sector is increasing. Now it is 45%.
Yeah.
And agriculture sector share in GDP, that is around 18%. So what do you think about what policy should be followed by India in that case? Thank you.
And last one.
Play would also be the skill set requirement, right? Like especially the business end of services, the skill requirement is very high compared to what like the average skill level or education level will be at the agriculture part. So that's something that may stop this kind of direct movement.
Trying to say this would happen magically. So that is obviously not the point. So as I said, I think the priorities to improve agricultural productivity will naturally be different in different countries. That is, we need to understand what is holding back agricultural productivity, or why is it that some countries tend to have higher agriculture shares. So for example, a lot of this is natural process. A lot of the countries that are actually have large shares of agricultural workforce are the low-income countries. So they naturally would tend to have higher workforce shares. But then you also see countries like Indonesia, Thailand, and India that have high workforce shares in agriculture. So I think it's important to look at what is it that's basically holding back some of this decline that should be happening as part of the natural process. Now, for some of the countries, so we looked at India, for example, we looked at other countries as well. Agriculture looks relatively close compared to manufacturing. So that's one feature that stands out. Agriculture is also a sector that in most countries would have a lot of intervention from the policymakers. The role of land in agriculture is much more crucial. Land as an asset itself is going to be important as well. So I think when we think about transition of workers out of agriculture, education is going to be key. Whether you can somehow compensate people for the transition cost that will happen as workers move out of agriculture. Social safety nets. Are there social safety nets that can compensate them for some of the loss of income that will happen along the way? I think all those things would have to be there to really help people get out of agriculture. But the other part of that is, how do you improve productivity in some of the stuff that you're doing already? So think about, I think in the Indian case, it's very well documented. The Green Revolution was a pretty big force in terms of changing the trajectory of agricultural productivity. Since then, agricultural productivity in India has declined. So what is it that needs to be done? I'm no expert in the agriculture sector in India, but I think we would have to look at the supply side issues as well. What needs to be changed to be able to raise that agricultural productivity level? So I completely take the point that this is going to be a tough task, especially if for countries where this share does look higher than what it usually should be at a given income level. I think then there was a question on AI's role. So I think, it's very clear that AI will basically come, or any technology for that matter, would come with costs and benefits. So the fact that AI, I think a chart that's worth looking at is maybe the chart that I didn't mention, which is the chart on the left. So if you think about AI as just simply replacing labor across the board, that's not true. So there are occupations that AI would be complementary to, and there are occupations where AI would be act more like a substituting technology. So here are examples of that. For example, here we are showing the red bars are high exposure occupations, but these are occupations that are likely to be complementary. So you have managers, you have professionals, you have technicians. Here you see a lot more complementarity. So here you have less of concerns about total replacement of workers. But then you certainly have occupations where that is more of a concern. So services and sales, clerical support workers, there you have a lot more exposure, but you also have a lot more substitutability. I think that's where what the concern that you're raising probably comes in first. And then if you think about a lot of the technical work, a lot of the machinist work, crafts and trades, these are occupations that don't have very high exposure. So I think given the occupational structure in, say, India or some of the other emerging and developing economies, a lot of the workforce is actually here and not on this side. So exposure level is right now low. But it's nonetheless the case that AI is likely to replace workers. So I think two key things that need to take place in the next few decades, which is, I think education, we would have to rethink quite seriously as to how we think about skill acquisition. The other part is we will need to think about social safety nets much more seriously than we have done so far, because the technology is evolving so rapidly that I think we are playing catch up, most likely. So I think the role of social safety nets is probably going to be a lot more important as we go ahead. And this is not just India, I think for most countries. Whether or not we can digitize slow or fast, I think is one of those questions of like, so it's a technology which will come with its own productivity gains as well. So if you consciously try to slow down the process of that digitization, then there are losses to be incurred as well. So I think that's a balance to be struck. I take that point. I think as policymakers, the job market or labor market implications of these are going to be pretty important. How do you balance that with the productivity gains side of it? The third point I think I should make is, with any innovation that takes place, I think what is harder to see is the jobs that it will create actually. So right now we can only see occupations that's likely to replace, but we don't see the occupations likely to create. So there's an interesting piece of work by David Autor looking at occupations that existed in pre-depression era and looking at occupations that exist now. And if you compare those two sets of occupations, you basically cannot map the pre-depression era 1920 occupation sets into what exists today. And clearly, huge amount of technological innovation has happened during that span. So I think there is also legitimacy to the arguments made by lots of people that yes, AI is going to replace workers, but AI is also going to create new jobs. And those jobs are harder to see right now. So I think that's the other point that I'd like to make. But certainly, I think if there's been a technology which has come close enough to substituting human mind, we are there. So that's why I think the level of anxiety about AI is much higher compared to any technological innovation that has happened so far. The the cognitive advantage that human beings have had is looking like that might be breached at some point. And if that does happen, then yes, substitutability of labor becomes a much larger concern. And I think social safety nets become much more front and center in that situation. Absolutely. China's demographics. So I think it's fair to say that China's growth trajectory has changed. It has slowed down considerably compared to what it was growing at. Part of that is being driven by demographics as well. Part of that is being driven by the natural process that I talked about, that as economies get richer, you demand and produce some of the other stuff. And some of the stuff may not be the things that are growing fastest in terms of productivity. If you look at across the world and the ability of policymakers to influence demographic change, or I wouldn't say reverse it, but slow it down in a meaningful way, I think there are very few examples of successes. So these are norms that are very hard to change. I think you have some examples here and there, but I think overall the picture that emerges is that despite lots of efforts and lots of policies of subsidizing, of supporting childcare, the demographic trends are very hard to reverse. So whether China can actually reverse that despite their reversal of one-child policy, I think if we go by history and if you look at the experience of European economies or Japan, I think it's just incredibly hard to reverse once it's set in motion. So, I mean, it can change, but so far the history tells us that it's very, very hard to change those norms. I think then there was a question on towards whether India should go towards services. So I should clarify that, look, I mean, the objective of this talk was not to say we should or should not go into services. Again, I should make that clarification. I'm simply trying to say that the engine of growth for Asia was industry and manufacturing, and that's shifting. Part of that is shifting because demand is shifting in a way that even if you try to stop it, you wouldn't be able to. Whether India should go into services or not, if we go by just where India is in terms of, let me see if I can go back. Yeah. Right, so in terms of income level, it's not as if India is here. So by income level standards, yes, India can have a higher manufacturing share. So there's absolutely a reason to expect that. First, yeah, let me make that clarification, not saying that India should go into services. All I'm saying is services should be unpacked a lot more and thought about in a lot more disaggregated fashion than we have been doing so far. And there are services that are clearly less productive, but there are services that seem to have a productivity profile that would look like manufacturing. So as long as you have workers that can fit in there, so be it. I don't see why there should be, you should be influencing that process. It has to be this or it has to be that. I think the other point to make is, compared to some of the economies here where demographics are slowing down and these countries don't have the kind of working age population that India has, the challenge for Indian policymakers is a lot acute, in the sense that the challenge is to actually create enough jobs, not worry so much about which sectors they should go into, in the sense that you should have all sectors basically growing as much as possible to be able to, because the demand for jobs is a lot higher. So I would say, that's actually the challenge in my mind for India, which is to create jobs, and that would require all sectors to be contributing, not just services or not just manufacturing. I think the thing to maybe flag is, if we are going to try to influence that process, then we have to think about distortions that might creep in, and what's the cost of those things, and whether that is going to be offset enough by the benefits that we think are going to come from that process, right? So that's a fair question to ask. I don't have the details of that, but I know this debate is front and center in India right now, that whether we should be thinking about manufacturing. I think, yeah, the global sort of trade fragmentation scenario is such right now that the trade map is changing, and that is creating a sort of a reallocation of their trade activity across the world. And India is certainly one of the countries that is going to play a role in that. So whether that's industry, whether that's services, I think from a job standpoint, it should be everything. India's challenge of creating enough jobs is a pretty staggering one. So it needs to probably leverage every sector possible, I would think. I think there was a question on India's agriculture share, and it's been rising recently. So at least my impression was that started with COVID, essentially, that a lot of the workforce that was in the urban areas was basically forced to head back. And that was the impetus for that process. Now, to what extent that is going to sort of be reversed as we go ahead, I don't know. But if COVID was the only reason for that, then one would expect that process should get reversed on its own. But if not, I don't know exactly what's driving that process. In terms of, I think that's partly related to the question that came up earlier. So I'm not trying to say that people should leave agriculture. The point here is, I think all these countries that have industrialized, they still have workforce in agriculture. And in some of these countries, they have huge subsidies going to agriculture sector. So I think what happens is that they are able to do a lot more with a much smaller workforce than India is doing right now. So the point here is, of course, you need food and you need good quality food. All of those things are going to be very important as we go ahead. But do you need as many workers as there are in agriculture right now to be able to produce that food? That's the point, I think, that needs to be answered. And that's the answer to that question is likely not. Those workers naturally should leave agriculture as productivity rises. And part of that process is going to be, yes, producing higher value-added goods. Maybe you're not just producing staple crops. Maybe you're producing crops that are more of the cash crops. Maybe these are crops that require much more sophisticated techniques to be able to produce. Or you produce processed agri-goods. So a lot of that value chain is there to be exploited. So I don't think it's a question of agriculture should shrink or not shrink. I think food as a thing that we will demand is always going to be there. So, but the question is how much of the workforce needs to be allocated to be able to do that. I thought those were the questions, right? Okay. Yeah.
Seminar, and like every good seminar, it raises more questions than it answers. But thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much.
All good things in life come to an end, and this stimulating discussion this evening is no exception. My heartfelt thanks to Dr. Surjit Bhalla ji. He is so busy, yet he agreed to our request to chair this session, and my profusely thanks on behalf of EGROW Foundation, on my own behalf and on behalf of our CEO, Professor Charan Singh. My sincere thanks to Rahul, who made it such a wonderful presentation. It really gave a stimulating impetus to all of us. It was a food for thought, and he presented the data in a manner perhaps nobody else can do. He dissected it layer by layer, peel by peel, and made the things very easy to comprehend. I will just draw an analogy of his presentation style with a medical doctor who tries in a very systematic manner what is ailing and how to go about that. And so basically he dissected, he gave the diagnostic things, but he consciously, that's my impression, stopped short of giving the prescription. What is the solution? So that we have to think over it, we have to ponder ourselves, what are the solutions. Perhaps my take is that we should have the homegrown solutions, because no solution fit all countries and all economy, because each situation is very different, and the doctor also says that the same disease cannot be treated by the same medicine in all patients. So similarly, homegrown solution that we have to go delve deeper into it. So I am grateful to him. He made very interesting points on the population pressure, how it is related to the GFC, the global financial crisis, and how the trade made, and then he really linked it with the demand side, which he perhaps a paucity of time, he didn't discuss too much on the demand side, but on the supply side. And demand, I think, is equally important, if not more. Gold is gold when it is sold. What cannot? So unless there is a demand, whether it is agriculture, industry, manufacturing, even the construction, it cannot. It doesn't mean anything, no matter how good quality you produce. So those are the things very important. And I can say on my personal behalf and on behalf of I know Charan very well, and so at least on EGROW Bana, I become richer in my intellect and the canvas and the spectrum of thinking. He raised the bar, and wonderful. And at the same time, my sincere thanks to all the participants. I know each one of you are very busy, yet you made it a point to come in, and that made the discussion more lively. My discussion to our EGROW staff, Professor Shalini, other supporting staff, and last but not the least, my sincere thanks goes to the India International Center who made this arrangement at a very short notice, and thanks to them. And now I would request all of you to please join over a cup of tea. And then whatever the questions remains, that can be discussed bilaterally or in a small group. Thanks indeed.
Thank you so much. Thank you. you.